The Dark Knight Returns, written and illustrated by Frank Miller, being one of the most influential works of comic art ever rendered. In the annals of comic book history, the importance of this work is of great eminence, not only because of what it did for the character who is the central focus of the story it tells, but also because of what it did for the medium through which that story was told. 1986, I think, can be pointed to as the year that comics came of age, if you will. That comics, as an art form, really vindicated itself as one possessing the ability of having real literary merit, because that was not the estimation of comics as an art form for a very long time in its history. Comics was not regarded very highly as regards its real artistic abilities. But the year 1986 saw the publication both of Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and also of Alan Moore's and Dave Gibbons's Watchmen, two works which forever altered the landscape of comic books by proving again that comics can have real literary and artistic value. So, what is the story of The Dark Knight Returns if you have not read it, if you are not familiar with it? Well, the work takes place in a rather dismal 1980s milieu in which all superheroes have pretty much been outlawed, with the exception of Superman, who is now a government stooge working for a kind of caricaturized Reagan administration. And Bruce Wayne, the one time Batman, has now become an alcoholic wastrel after being forcibly retired 10 years previously. He is now in his 50s, and he is basically just aimless in life, just, drinking himself to death, has no real purpose anymore. And Gotham City has since gone to absolute shit. Gang violence is running rampant. People are getting just murdered left and right. It's pretty, like I say, dismal. But one day, Bruce Wayne has seen enough, and eventually the Batman persona in him overpowers him and returns to the fore, and he returns to his role as Batman. The actual relationship between Bruce Wayne and Batman in this work is one that's almost kind of like demonic, like the Batman alter ego is some kind of devil or something that like kind of possesses him. It's very kind of dark, very kind of ominous force as it's depicted. But anyway, so Bruce Wayne, now in his 50s, returns after a decade of inaction to fighting crime as the Caped Crusader. And the work is divided into four books, four parts. In the first part, he contends with a newly released Harvey Dent, that is Two-Face, who has returned to a life of crime, and Batman has to thwart the schemes of his longtime enemy. Then the second part sees Batman facing off against the brutal leader of a gang of hooligans known as the Mutants. He gets his ass handed to him at first because he's an old man, right? Or fairly old anyway, to be doing Batman shit, right? So he gets his ass beat, but he gets saved at the last minute by a young girl named Carrie Kelly, who has kind of taken it upon herself to become a new Robin, if you will, because he actually saved her earlier in the work, and so she's kind of trying to pay him back, wanting to kind of become his protege, and so he kind of takes her under his wing as his new de facto Robin. He recuperates, and he goes back, and then he beats the ass of the gang leader, the mutant leader, and in so doing kind of inspires what's left of the gang to become a gang of vigilantes in his own likeness, kind of much more violent and lethal though. Then in the third part, we see Batman facing off one last time against his mortal nemesis, the Joker. And then in the fourth and final part, after some international nuclear exchanges causes America to experience an electromagnetic pulse and wide-scale blackouts and a nuclear winter, and American society to kind of descend into anarchy. The actions of Batman in Gotham making the city forcibly a safer place become kind of an embarrassment to the government, and so Superman is ordered to bring his one-time friend into custody. But Batman ain't going down without a fight, so it ends in one of the most memorable battles in comic book history, when Batman faces off against Superman, and with a little help from his friends and some synthesized kryptonite, beats Superman's ass to a pulp, but then seemingly dies of a heart attack. Only for it to be revealed in the end that he faked his own death, and then Batman goes underground to continue his war on crime less conspicuously. That is the story of The Dark Knight Returns in a nutshell. So let's talk about the technical qualities of this work, as well as why this work is so seminal to the medium of comic books. So normally with reviewing books, right, I talk about the prose, I talk about the writing, but being as this is a comic book, a visual, mostly formatted story, I guess I'll talk about the artwork when it comes to this. So the artwork in The Dark Knight Returns can take a little getting used to, because Frank Miller's artwork is very, shall I say, stylized at times. It's very kind of scratchy at times, very kind of jagged at times, and it also vacillates between very defined anatomical realism and then kind of slightly exaggerated cartoonish qualities. It's kind of it's an acquired taste, I'll say that. However, I like it, or I came to like it, because I remember the first time I read The Dark Knight Returns. This is not the first time I've read it. The first time I read it, I was kind of like, the artwork does take some getting used to, but I finally did manage to get used to it, and honestly, I think Frank Miller really is a great artist. He is. It's not going to be for everybody's tastes, probably, but everything in this book is intentional. Like, everything, even as stylized as it gets, even as kind of odd as it can get, and then there's some parts in this where it is kind of admittedly difficult to actually tell what's happening. But all that being said, I like the artwork. I think it serves the story well, because it kind of accentuates the in many ways nightmarish aspects of this world. It kind of just fits. It feels appropriately gritty, appropriately kind of unpolished at times, but I think it works for the story, so I like the artwork. Some people may not, but I do. So let's talk about the characters, because it's very important to note how this book basically redefined the character of Batman, because this was Batman for a whole new age. And specifically, the way that Frank Miller reinvented Batman in this story is largely why this book is so acclaimed, because it's a depiction which is loaded with certain philosophical and socio-political underpinnings as well. In particular, I'm referring to the fact that Frank Miller was inspired by the writings of Ayn Rand, actually. That's right, Ayn Rand, one of the most contentious public figures out there, but whether or not you like or dislike her, she did indirectly basically save Batman, because the way that Frank Miller depicts Batman in this work is very in line with objectivist principles. In fact, Batman in The Dark Knight Returns is basically a Randian Ubermensch, and I think that's actually the optimum portrayal of Batman. You know, the thing about Batman is that you can interpret and reinterpret him in various different ways. Like in the original Batman comics, I'm talking like the OG, the oldest Batman comics, he was a stone cold killer who was not afraid to use guns, just smoking fools right and left. And then as things go along and comics got kind of clamped down on by the man, Batman got reinterpreted into something much more safe much more campy and goofy, as per like the 1960s Adam West Batman. But then we come to the 1980s, and Batman got reinterpreted again into something much, much grimmer, much, much darker. This was definitely not the campy 1960s Adam West Batman. This was Batman for the 1980s, right? But the way that Batman is depicted, like I said, he's basically just a Randian Ubermensch. He is, a billionaire industrialist who is basically beholden to nobody. And also, he answers to nobody but himself. He answers to nobody but his own conscience because he has his own code, his own set of values, and he doesn't deviate from that. And also, he's got a mind like freaking Stephen Hawking. He's always 2,000 steps ahead of everybody. He is just the absolute ultimate badass. And that's why we love Batman. Like I said, I would argue this is the optimum depiction of Batman. He is nearly at like demigod status. He has the body of a Greek god and a mind, like I say, of like Stephen Hawking. He's rich as hell. He doesn't answer to anybody. He doesn't need anybody. He is playing by his own rules, and that's why we love Batman, because all of us would give our left arm to be Batman, or at least this version of Batman, because he is such a badass. And Frank Miller really did, like, I think, redefine Batman in his optimal version, if you will. This Batman was far removed from the campier version of the decades prior. But he is also an interesting character, and that is the thing, is that he does have a very complex psyche in this. And also the way that Frank Miller reinterpreted the relationship between the Bruce Wayne and Batman personas is very interesting, because it's very, very, like, foreboding. Like, it feels like the Batman persona in this is some kind of like demon. It's very dark, and it's like some kind of violent impulse that's like bursting at the seams and always wanting out. And that's why Bruce Wayne kind of has to drown the Batman persona out with alcohol when he's not being able to indulge in kicking ass like Batman wants to do, right? But he's still a complex character, not only because he kind of almost has like a split personality, but also because it's the way that he views his mission in this. It's very militaristic. It is very, very militaristic. In fact, he refers to Carrie, or Robin, as a soldier. He views himself as like as a warrior fighting a war, right? That his crusade against crime is like it is kind of like a holy war for him. In fact, I believe it's referred to in that way in here. And he is very, very much of a hard ass. He has very little sense of humor, very serious, but still there's aspects of tenderness to his character, and it all comes out to a very memorable character. And once again, for the record, probably the optimum depiction of Batman of all the varieties of Batman that we have had. This is probably the best one, honestly, I think. So the character of Batman is awesome, but also we have the characters of like Carrie, who is like the new Robin, very kind of street smart kid who kind of has a mind of her own, doesn't really want to follow orders, but is trying to ingratiate herself to Batman because he saved her, right? Good character there, and I think it really fits the story quite well, because it's a good dynamic between Batman and her kind of more exuberant personality with his more dour and grim personality. It's a really good dynamic. The dynamic duo, right? That it really is a good dynamic between them in this. But also we have the character of Superman, and Superman in this work, actually he's never referred to as Superman, I think. Rather, his identity as Clark Kent is like plainly known, and so he's just referred to as Kent or Clark. But his character is very complex in this as well, because he is basically kind of just an emasculated cuck for the government now. He allowed himself to be strong armed into being just a shill for the system. And we get some interior monologuing from him in here where he um, laments the fact of what he has become but sees no other way, and that he feels as though he has to submit to, a higher authority than himself, which, again, in keeping with the Randian elements of this, that is like in total contradistinction to Batman's mentality in this. Because, again, Batman does not bow to anybody but Batman, and that's why we love Batman, because that kind of just beholden to no one badass hero is just, again, it's just cool. It is really just cool. But anyway, Superman is also a good character in this. So the characters in this are memorable, definitely. And again, especially when it comes to Batman, this is what gave Batman his balls back after decades of campiness and goofiness. Batman got his balls back with The Dark Knight Returns, and once again, was kind of rendered in his optimum depiction, in my opinion, anyway. So now let's talk about like the reasons why this work was such a vindication for the medium of comic books. Why The Dark Knight Returns is such a lauded and influential work. And that is because this book forever changed the game when it came to comics. And the reasons for that may not be what a lot of people think. Now, as this work and Watchmen came out in the same year, they're both united in the fact that they're much darker stories than comics had been wont to tell largely hitherto. And I think a lot of people kind of just take that at surface value and say, well, they changed things because it was no longer like just kid fare, right? Like this was definitely not aimed at children. I mean, hell, you've got hookers getting beaten up by pimps. You've got children and people just getting blown away and wasted by the dozens in this. It's super violent. And also, there's quite a bit of profanity in this as well. It was definitely not aimed at children, or at least not at children exclusively. It was aimed for a more mature audience. And I think a lot of people are apt to look at that and say, well, they're dark and gritty, so that's why this really vindicated comics as an art form. But that is not the case, or at least not the case entirely. Rather, the reason why The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen are so influential and why they vindicated the comics medium is because they did things that only comics could do. They told their stories in a way that was optimum for comics, that was only really doable in the medium of comics. And this is noticeable in the way that the story is laid out in The Dark Knight Returns, in particular, in the scene where Batman is reliving the murder of his parents. Miller gives us, I think it's a 16 panel layout on each page, and the murder of the Waynes is depicted totally without dialogue, totally pictorially, without any narration, just, again, panel by panel by panel. But the great thing is that when you flip the page after that, you see that Bruce Wayne is at his atrium, is in his atrium at his house, and the panels have become the panel, like the window panes of the atrium, right? It's the way that layout from the previous page just kind of glides right into the physical layout of the environment of the following scene. Great little trick. But also, another thing that happens in this work that really showcases Miller's insight into how to tell stories specifically for the comic book medium happens in the climactic final showdown between Batman and his mortal nemesis, the Joker. And it's something that I think a lot of people might not pick up on, actually. So in that scene, Batman's interior monologue, because a lot of the story is narrated through his interior monologue as he is describing his feelings and stuff like that. But Batman's interior monologue is depicted in dark gray text blocks. And the Joker's interior monologue is depicted in green blocks, but everybody's dialogue is generally depicted in white speech bubbles, right? But in the scene where Batman faces off for the last time with the Joker and snaps the Joker's neck, something interesting happens because if you've read it, you'll know that Batman just kind of partially breaks the Joker's neck. He like paralyzes him, and then the Joker just like finishes himself off by like snapping what's left of his spine to make people think that Batman just, that he finally broke his one rule. But the interesting thing in this scene is that the Joker's speech bubbles at that point change to the dark gray, which has previously been used to depict Batman's interior monologue. The implication here being that Batman actually did just straight up kill the Joker, and that the following interaction between them consists of his own tortured psyche trying to make sense of this and create an out for him where he didn't really break his one rule. That is, the Joker is actually dead, and it's just him talking to himself, basically. It's just Batman talking to himself, basically, because the Joker's speech bubbles subtly shift to reflect the interior monologue of Batman. That is something that I think a lot of readers might just go right over and not really pick up on the significance of, but it is just a great little trick that Miller puts in there, which showcases why Miller is one of the most acclaimed writers in the comic book medium, because he knew how to tell this story in a way that was specifically for the medium of comics. But beyond just, the way that The Dark Knight Returns reinvented Batman, beyond the way that it vindicated comics as an art form, The Dark Knight Returns is also a work which really captured the cultural zeitgeist of the 1980s. In fact, I think I would go so far as to say that The Dark Knight Returns is one of the quintessential pop culture works of the 1980s. And tonally, it is a remarkably distinct work because it is the only work that I have ever read that I can think of that is at once both deadly serious and also gleefully satirical at the same time. The Dark Knight Returns takes place in kind of a warped comic bookified version of America, which includes parodic caricatures of various pop culture figures, such as President Reagan, such as David Letterman, such as Dr. Ruth, right? It's so, like I say, gleefully satirical in the way that it's kind of just poking fun at the various figures of its day. But more than that, it also is able to kind of capture a certain atmosphere, a certain mentality, which was kind of unique to urban America at that time. And I'm kind of referring specifically to the high crime levels in like coming off of the 1970s, the kind of high crime levels in New York City, which actually led to the real life subway vigilante Bernard Goetz, I think his name was. And the way that Miller depicts the actions of the Batman in this story feels very in line with the prevailing attitudes of that time. In fact, one aspect of the way that the story is told is that Miller uses kind of the talking heads of like television news to relay the events of the story and propel the story forward, and it works remarkably well. It not only allows Miller to comment on like yellow journalism, because the news anchors are depicted as almost like sadistically enjoying relating these various horrendous crimes and such, but also Miller uses the kind of man on the street interview format to depict the various reactions of society to the actions of Batman. And again, it skewers just so many different strata of society. Like one instance in here is when one character is being interviewed, and he's kind of just like your typical like ivory tower liberal type character, and he says, I believe that the socially misaligned must be treated with compassion and rehabilitated, not brutalized like Batman is doing. And then he says, oh, hell no, I'd never live in the city, though, by the way. And it's like, just like spot on with certain mentalities, right? And then you also have the kind of spread of vigilantism as the people who have just had enough of the crime kind of view Batman as like a symbol, right? That is what Batman is meant to be, right? Like that's what the bat is. It's a symbol, and the people, certain other people in society start to kind of engage in vigilantism on their own. And then there's various debates back and forth through these media figures in the story about the justness or unjustness of Batman's actions. And it really gives a quite comprehensive picture that makes the world of the comic feel very real and very lived in, and in many ways very true to life. Even though this is a pretty far out story, kind of, it does have an element of at least psychological realism to it. And also the way that the core like theme of the story is the man versus the state, right? Of an ineffective government which can no longer control crime, in which citizens are being victimized right and left, and then the one man who is willing to take upon himself the burden of dispensing justice. And that also plays into kind of the reason why not only is this a fundamentally 1980s story, this is a fundamentally American story as well. Because some of the characters throughout the work remark, like, there's actually an instance in the book where one of the characters is like, Batman represents a reemergence of the American fighting spirit. And it kind of plays into kind of like, the American character, because there's a reason why the superhero such as Batman is an American invention. There's a reason why Batman is not a Chinese character or a Japanese character, because in those Eastern kind of cultures, the notion of an individual usurping law enforcement and dispensing justice unilaterally, it would be unthinkable or abhorrent. But we celebrate that in America because America is a much more individualistic nation, and we kind of have a history of actual vigilantism going back to like the Old West days, the Wild West days, where you had like frontier justice, right, where cattle thieves and horse thieves and murderers were kind of just summarily lynched without any kind of formal proceedings. Vigilantism is actually kind of an aspect, I think, that's kind of ingrained in the historical American psyche, and the depiction of Batman rising up to do what the government either cannot or will not any longer do. It definitely gives this work an added philosophical depth. And again, going back kind of to the Randian roots of this, you can kind of feel the kind of objectivist underpinnings of this. But it makes for good storytelling because it makes for a memorable conflict as we see Batman, the arch individualist, facing off against the conformist Superman. It makes for a really good conflict. And also, another way that this book is intriguing is that there is also a slight meta quality to it, because the story of The Dark Knight Returns situates itself in a post-superhero world where superheroes, with the exception of Superman, have been basically outlawed. But it uses the prior comics in DC's canon as kind of a backdrop for its story. In particular, the book opens with an article written by Jimmy Olsen from the Superman comics, talking about the golden age, back when we had heroes, we had the superheroes back in the golden age. But there's a double meaning with that word golden age, because it's referring both to a bygone kind of halcyon era, but it's also referring kind of implicitly to the golden age of comic books, right? Because comics have gone through different eras. Like the 40s and 50s were the golden age, right? The 60s and 70s were like the silver age. And then you get to the 80s and 90s, and then you're squarely in the bronze age. And this work is squarely in the bronze age of comics, where things were much darker, The kind of kid gloves were off. The strict parameters of what a story could and could not do were being relaxed. So it was getting much more experimental, much more audacious and daring in its narrative contents. But that use of the golden age in the article which opens this work is interesting because it's referring to the fact that the golden age of comics is gone, and now we're squarely in the Bronze Age, the dark and gritty Bronze Age. It's really a very layered and well-rounded work. Now, to talk about my criticisms of it, I really only have one. I really only have one criticism, and that would have to be the ending. Because Frank Miller gave in to the thing that a lot of authors who it seems that a lot of authors that tell these stories of the hero at sunset, of the aging hero coming out of retirement for one last fight, it seems like they kind of tend to give in to the same trappings, which is to not end it with the hero's death. Because in the end of this, after Batman fights and beats the crap out of Superman, he fakes his own death, so everybody will think that he is out of the picture, and so he can just continue doing his stuff underground in a more discreet way. But that really, I don't think, was the best way to end this, if only because it permitted Miller to write the sequel to this, and we're not even going to talk about that because the funny thing about Frank Miller is that he wrote an all-time classic with The Dark Knight Returns, and then wrote an all-time piece of shit with The Dark Knight Strikes Again. But we're not going to talk about that. But nonetheless, this really should have ended with Batman dying, I think, because it would have been more fitting, and it really would have fulfilled the entire promise of this work. So, The Dark Knight Returns, much like most stories, it did not, like, from the beginning to the end, it was not just one single draft. It went through different iterations, I think. And I believe I read somewhere, and I can't recall exactly where, but I believe I read somewhere that Frank Miller said that in the original draft of the story, it was going to end with Batman being gunned down by the police, or with Batman being killed. And honestly, that would have been a better ending to this, I think, because, like, the entire purpose of this story is that it's the end, right? Like, this is Batman's last hurrah. He's over the hill. He's no longer in his prime. He came out of retirement because he had to fulfill that violent urge in himself, but also he had to do what nobody else was willing to do. But in so doing, puts himself at odds with the law, right? But it would have been more fulfilling, I think, if he had just killed Batman at the end of this, because that, like, since he didn't, it's kind of like, what was the purpose of all this? Like, the entire point of this story is that Batman is looking for a good death. Like, he even says repeatedly, it is a running motif throughout the story that he is looking for a noble, fitting death to end his crime fighting career with. That he is looking for that noble death to die. But then when you get to the end and he doesn't die, he just fakes his death, and so he continues on being Batman. It's kind of just like, what was the point of all this? Like, I mean, it's not the worst ending ever, I guess. Like, in the final line, like, this is actually quite good, but at the same time, I really can't help but think that it would have been better served to have Batman die, and then to have, like, somebody else take up the mantle, right? To have his the Batman persona kind of, like, diffuse out into society to where we have other Bat people rising up to fight the gangs and all the crime and stuff. I think it would have been more fulfilling that way, to have the story actually end with Batman dying. But ifs and buts. But that is my one real criticism of this, is that I think that in hindsight, it should have ended with a bit more finality than it did, if only to spare us all from the absolutely atrocious sequel to this, but which we're not going to talk about. But Anyway, so to rate The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller, I'm giving this an A. Not quite an unqualified A plus, because again, I think it should have ended differently than it did. But that aside, this is just an all-time classic work. This is truly like this is S tier material in the realm of comic books. It changed the game. It gave Batman his balls back and also reinvented him into once more, I think, the optimum depiction of the character. But it also vindicated comic books as a medium, and also kind of captured the zeitgeist of the era in which it was written. Right? I mean, it's so intrinsically 1980s. The mutants, the gang in this wear like Devo glasses. You've got the kind of caricatured Reagan character, and then the David Letterman parody and the Dr. Ruth parody, like and of course the kind of the atmosphere of unease and criminality running rampant in large urban areas. Like it is so intrinsically 1980s. And again, I would say it's just like one of the quintessential works of pop culture of the 1980s, actually. So it's just an all around, just, classic work. It's just, again, S tier stuff. So yeah, for me, The Dark Knight Returns is getting an A. Have you read The Dark Knight Returns? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read The Dark Knight Returns, if you are even, a casual fan of comics, this is like must read stuff. Like, you have to read this, because this is just, again, it's just, it changed the game. It changed the game. It vindicated an entire medium of storytelling. It's just all-time classic. So yeah, I would recommend this. And it's also just the definitive Batman story. Like, if you're a fan of Batman, this is the definitive story of that character. So just a must-read work from me. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.